Yes, my name is Nancy Urbanec. I am an Associate Extension Assistant here in Douglas and Sarpy counties, and welcome to our culinary studio. I was looking at some of the information and some of the other programs, and I was thinking, oh, this is going to be much different than what they normally do, so I hope it goes over well. But the reason I decided to do it this way was to be able to share some of the information and some of the different equipment and such that we have. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Lots of people do have questions, or even after the conversation tonight, if you have other questions, we're always available to visit with you. And we have some great people across the state that work in the food preservation area also. I just happen to be the one on the side of the state. So we are going to go ahead and get started, because food preservation isn't just about canning. I mean, you can see I have my canners out and everything. I've got my canned goods and such, but I do want to touch on a couple other things that have been around for a long time. Don't necessarily take really special equipment, but take a little bit of time and energy to be able to preserve also. The first one I'm going to talk about is preserving in a dehydrator. And so let me grab my dehydrator off my cart here and bring it on over. The dehydrator is one of those things where I will be honest with you, I have a dehydrator at home and I sometimes forget about using it. Although this last weekend I decided, okay, I'm going to use the dehydrator, see how it goes, and we'll go from there. The thing with a dehydrator is you can dry things like fruits and vegetables. You can make fruit leather, beef jerky, all those different kinds of things. If you don't have a dehydrator, like this is obviously a pretty old dehydrator that's been around for a while, but it is basically a dehydrator that has the racks. It has the capability to go ahead and force air at a certain temperature through this piece of equipment. And that's basically what dehydrating is. It's just taking that moisture from that fruit or vegetable and pulling it out at a rate. Well, so this weekend, just like this week it's hot, it was humid also this weekend and hot. So I thought, I know that I need to do some cherry tomatoes because I've run out of ideas for using them, and I love them fresh, but there's only a point where you can only eat so many. So I went ahead and did some cherry tomatoes. If I'd have been smart, I would have brought just a cherry tomato. The prep on these, we're just washing them. And I don't mean washing with soap and water. I just mean putting them in the colander, making sure that they're run through all the dirt and the stem is off, cutting them in half, and then putting them onto the dehydrator racks. Once they're on the dehydrator racks, just like any type of fruit or vegetable that you might be dehydrating, you want to level them out. You want to make sure that they are as close to the same size so that everything is drying at the same rate. And then I let them dry. So my tomatoes, actually, because it was so humid, took about 12 to 14 hours in this piece of equipment, which is meant for dehydrating, to dry them out. But I've done peppers, I've done corn, I've done flat, slicer tomatoes, I've done fruit leather, apples, all kinds of things. So usually it takes about 10 to 12 hours continuous running, and there's a fan in here that runs that heat, brings it up, and such. So drying is not the issue, but then at the end, taking it out and letting it cool for about an hour, because of course what happened, my cherry tomatoes were kind of sticking to the rack. Cooled them a little bit, pushed them around a little bit to get them to unstick, and then let them cool more. And as you can see, of 3 racks of cherry tomatoes, I ended up with, I'd say, 3/4 of a pint of dried fruit. And any type of fruit that I dry, I let it cool completely, take it off the rack, put it into jars that I can put a lid on. So I could use a quart-sized jar, I could use a pint-sized jar. I used a pint-sized jar because I don't have that many tomatoes in here. Let them sit for a couple days. So today's Tuesday, so I let it sit. Monday, today. And as I'm shaking it, what I'm trying to look at is you can see that some of the tomatoes are stuck. So they're kind of sticky, which means there's some moisture in those tomatoes, making them stick to the sides of the jar. And they're not all shaking free and loose. Anything that's dried properly, it'll just shake free and loose and you won't have anything sticky. So my job then in the next couple days, to put this back onto some racks, dry a little bit more, get them a little bit drier so there's no moisture. The problem with moisture in any jar like this that I've dehydrated is that it can actually mold on me. And so you want to make sure you've got it down to a low enough water activity so that you don't create that environment where mold is going to grow. So again, I'll have to dry it a little bit more, do the same kind of, let it sit a couple days, see if I can shake it all loose. And if I can, I'm good to go. I can store these in the refrigerator. I can store them in the freezer. I can store them in a pantry situation. Very easy to do. And so I can put these into items like frittata. I can put them in these are tiny, so they go great in scrambled eggs or on pizzas, or I can rehydrate them for bruschetta or whatever I want to do with it. But don't forget about dehydrating as another option for food preservation, because it's a great option that's available out there. My boss, Cindy Bryson, has an air fryer, and she and a specialist out at the university decided that they would take 3 different air fryers, take apple slices, and then there's some air fryers that actually have a dehydrator setting to them. And so she actually dehydrated apples a couple weeks ago. Again, it worked. It wasn't quite like a dehydrator, a natural dehydrator. I mean, this one, is meant for that. You can also dehydrate in an oven. You can dehydrate in a microwave, little herbs and such. But if you have big loads of things that you want to dry, really, a larger piece of equipment is going to give you a much better results. So dehydrating is one thing that you could do when you are doing food preservation and you want your items dried. The next thing, go ahead.
Yeah, we have one question that I think you should answer now. And I know the answer to this, but I want the official answer from you. Would it have to be completely dehydrated if you poured olive oil into the jar? Like you were adding the tomatoes to olive oil to make like a sun-dried tomato olive oil.
Actually, it wouldn't have to be, but you would need to use it fairly quickly if you were going to do that. So our son he asked about that the other day, and I said, I prefer to have it completely dry because we can't use this many sun-dried tomatoes. So I make it as we go along. So I rehydrate them just a little bit, drain them, add the olive oil, and then I use it in, because if there happens to be any bacteria and you put olive oil in it and make it in an anaerobic environment, you can actually promote the growth of bacteria. So I choose to do it with just a small amount as we go along, instead of possibly having too much and then having to, because you would have to store it then very specifically. Unlike things that are shelf stable, that are sun-dried tomatoes, you would definitely have to put this in the refrigerator and use it within I would say probably a week or 10 days if you were doing it that way.
Yeah, I think the key is the shelf stable there. Most people, like they want to do it with like bottle it up to give gifts as Christmas. Like it's not a long-term, like it's a week or less, use it in the fridge kind of thing. And that's for any of the oils. Like if you add, herbs or anything to oil, it is not shelf stable.
Correct. That's exactly right. And that's just, and it would be great if we could, but unfortunately that just isn't an option. And I know you can look on it. I know you can go to the grocery store and purchase things, but if you start really reading the labels of those items that are like the sun-dried tomatoes and the herbs and such that are in that anaerobic environment, they're very specific about how you need to handle that after that jar has been opened. And they can get away with making it shelf stable until it's open because of the processes that they have to go through to make sure it's safe. Make sense? Oh.
Another dehydrating question while we're here.
Mhm.
If you've dehydrated fruit, what is the shelf life? In other words, how long can you store it and still have quality?
Actually dried things, as long as it's stored and not, not in sunlight and too high of environment of temperature and humidity, it will keep a good year. And it kind of goes along the lines with anything that we are processing and making shelf stable also. You can look at my canned goods, and some of them are a little more than a year old, but most of them are within the last year or few months, because most canned goods, most dried goods, storing them appropriately, they best quality, best nutrition, and everything is better within the year.
Well, thank you for that. I think we're ready to move on to your next technique here.
Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is freezing. And obviously with freezing, you need good quality produce, just like drying is. You want to make sure that you have the adequate freezer space, because if you don't, things won't freeze quick enough, and that can cause freezer burn in the product that you put into your freezer. So you need a big pot, and you might use a colander. You might use just a slotted spoon, something like that. And for purposes, because it is warm and I'm not boiling water in my kitchen today, I'm pretending I have boiling water in here, obviously. So for freezing produce, you want to make sure that for vegetables, you're blanching it. And there are a few vegetables you don't have to blanch, like peppers and onions and tomatoes. Tomatoes have to be, they do have to be cored before they are frozen, but they really do not need to go through the blanching process. But things like corn, carrots, green beans, asparagus, anything like that, you want to make sure that you are what we call blanching. And basically all that means is you are boiling it for a particular amount of time to stop any of the enzymes from maturing in that freezer situation. So you blanch for a particular amount of time, boiling water. You have a big bowl of ice water over here. Pretend with me. Have ice water over here. You take your boiling, we'll pretend this is green beans. We boiled our green beans for 3 minutes. So we blanched them for 3 minutes. We throw them into our ice water. We let, kind of the rule of thumb is the amount of time you blanch is the same amount of time you leave them in the ice water. And that helps stop that blanching process. It also helps to kind of cool it so that you can drain it and then get it into your freezer bags or containers. And I have some examples here of freezer containers that I'm going to show you. So this is just a rigid sided container that for freezing. This, or you might use, if you have a vacuum sealer, you might use that. So this is just a vacuum sealer. It's got corn in it. It was blanched, put the corn in, put it into the vacuum sealer, and it seals it up, and you've got frozen, put that in the freezer. This is just a little silicone kind of product that you can put things in. It's divided. This just has herb butters in it. So it's divided. You just take it out the area that you want. Also, there are reusable freezer bags, and they look like a regular resealable bag, but it's a little bit heavier than some of our freezer bags are. Also, there's other like these freezer bags. So any type of bag that's going to be freezer compatible is what you're looking for. And the main reason you don't want to use like the sandwich bag or storage bags is that it actually allows air into those bags, and then any type of product you have in there could possibly get freezer burn. So ice crystals form and such. And you know, freezer burn is not a safety issue, but it is a quality issue. And so if you're going to do this much work to get a good quality product, you want to make sure that you're using good quality bags so that you can prevent that freezer burn from occurring. So making sure you're doing that appropriately. So the other thing with freezing is also making sure that you are filling your freezer with either with what we call a dry pack, which is this is actually zucchini, grated zucchini that was just grated and put into the container. This is obviously the corn. It was blanched, cooled, put into the container, Ziploc bag. So these are what we call a dry pack. So they go directly into the freezer. Or you might do something that we call a tray pack, or a tray pack method. And I use this a lot, and actually I did it this morning at the house. When I go home, I have something I have to put into freezer containers because the strawberries were starting to look a little sad. So I cleaned, ran cold water on them, patted them dry, get them as dry as you can, and then took the hull off, and then just single layer, put them in onto a jelly roll pan. So this is obviously a half of jelly roll pan sheet, typical. And then stick that in the freezer. Once it's solidly frozen, take it, put it into your freezer containers, and then label it, and always put it into your freezer. A lot of people use this for berries and such, so that if they have, like you can see, my tomatoes are all clumped together, right? This would not be good to try and get them apart for a smoothie. So if you do a tray pack, you can actually whole thing, a small amount out, a handful or whatever out of the package, and toss them into your blender, and you've got yourself a nice little smoothie. So keeping track of that is important. Fruits typically do not need to be heated. They just can go directly into the freezer. They're typically not blanched. There are some times when you might want to blanch something because in the end you want it to have a certain texture or a certain quality or look to it. Visual cue. The thing I'm thinking of is like apples. Apples, you can freeze them to make pies. And so you do blanch those. Typically the recommendation is to blanch them, cool them, and then put them into the freezer containers. And then when you're ready to make your pie, you put all your other ingredients together, put it in your shell, and bake it off. So that might be one of those times where it breaks kind of the rule of you don't blanch typical fruits and such. So just keeping that in mind. So is there any questions about freezing?
What is the best way to freeze peaches? I think you might have just answered that, but if you have any thoughts on peaches.
Yeah, basically you want to make sure that you're using some kind of product. Now this happens to be the one container we had in the office today that I can find, but like it's fruit fresh. You want to make sure that you're using something that's gonna keep those products, peaches especially, from turning brown as you're manipulating them and getting them into freezer containers. You don't really want them brown after they come out of the freezer. It's pretty unappealing. So using something like Fruit Fresh can be used for that particular thing. You also might use Fruit Fresh when you're dehydrating something. I forgot to say that earlier, but like bananas, as soon as you cut them, they start to turn brown. So you do need to use some type of product to make them from getting brown on you, and then just put them into your freezer. I do a dry pack for my peaches. Some people that I talk to, they always do a syrup solution. So they do a syrup, they get their peaches, they peel them, they cut them up, they put them into the syrup solution, heat them a little bit, then they put that and they cool it, and then they freeze it. So it's just kind of personal preference at that point. I think peaches are sweet enough, so we don't want to, so I don't really want to add more sweetness to them. So the other thing with peaches, since you brought up peaches, is that and I won't probably talk about that in the canning part, but peaches, if you have the white peaches or what they call donut peaches, those cannot be processed in a boiling water canner. The only way for long-term preservation on those is to do them, either dehydrate them or freeze them. So.
Thank you, Nancy. It's not a question, but a comment. Someone that says, I freeze trays of grapes, blueberries, and cherries and then take them out a little at a time. That way the fresh fruit that I buy, if I have too much, doesn't mold in the refrigerator. So
yeah, that's, and that's, food preservation isn't just putting up a harvest so that you can feed the family for the next 6 or 8 months. It's helping with economically preventing you from wasting your hard-earned dollars by throwing things into the compost. I have nothing wrong with composting, but I don't want to throw perfectly good stuff into the compost. I really want to spend my money more wisely than that. So.
Well, thank you. I think we're ready to move on to the next.
Okay, sounds great. So the next part is probably the most questions we get in the office, because people can be kind of intimidated by the pressure canner, the boiling water canner, making vegetables shelf stable and such. I've been doing this longer than I care to tell people, probably. I grew up in a household with a very large family and a very large garden. So we did buy lots of groceries, don't get me wrong, but there were ways to supplement our grocery dollars by growing and producing and putting up our own produce. So I have been, the one thing that's very new to me in canning has typically been the atmospheric steam canner, and also an electric canner that we're kind of experimenting with here at the office also. So traditionally, a boiling water canner and a pressure canner are typically the things that most people have used, and I've upgraded from my granite canner to a stainless steel. Just an FYI, here at the office, our oven, our stovetops are induction. So we had to actually purchase a large pot that's tall enough to accommodate boiling water canning, and also a pressure canner that's an induction pressure canner. So if you have a stove that's not a gas or not a traditional coil or anything, you can find the equipment to do this. So don't be disheartened, just be persistent, basically. So what I'm saying. So we do have the pressure canner, we do have the boiling water canner, and I'm going to grab a couple of my things here, and I'm going to show you these 3 pieces of equipment. And there we go. I want to make sure my screen doesn't go blank. We have some new security system here, and it shuts down if it's inactive for a certain period of time. So I want to make sure I don't go dark on you guys. So we have a pressure canner here. This is what we call the boiling water canner, and this is the atmospheric steam canner. The purpose of all 3 of these is to make sure that what food we put into a jar is going to get a vacuum seal. And each one of these will accomplish it. But the one thing with each one of these is they heat at a different temperature. So a pressure canner can get up to 242 degrees. A boiling water canner and its atmospheric steam canner get to 212. The reason that we have the three different options are really actually two different options. These two kind of are together the same. The reason we have these different options is that when we talk about produce that's low acid, so any type of corn, carrots, beets, green beans, all of those are what we call low acid food. And when we have low acid food, we have to raise the temperature higher than boiling to destroy any microorganisms in that jar and pull as much of the air out of that produce to get a solid vacuum seal. And the only way to accomplish it in vegetables is this. The other things that you would can in a pressure canner would be spaghetti sauce, mixed vegetables, meats, seafood, so like poultry and those kinds of things are all done in a pressure canner because they have to be higher in temperature. And the only way to accomplish that is by pressure canning them. I do have people ask sometimes, well, why can't I just do it in a boiling water canner or a boiling or atmospheric canner for longer? You know, if I do green beans in this for 30 minutes, why can't I do them in here for 2 hours and it accomplishes the same thing? The reason that can't accomplish it is this is only going to boil to 212. That inside of that jar is never going to get higher than 212. You can boil it for 6 days and it still won't get above 212. It has to reach higher temperatures up in the 240s to make sure that it is all the bacteria inside of that jar is destroyed. So it has to be done in a pressure canner because it has to raise to that particular temperature. And you can't accomplish that in these guys right here. So other things, I didn't actually say this for the other food preservation things, but always start with clean hands, always start with clean equipment and clean countertops, washing your produce. You also can't make your produce better by canning it. So if you're starting with anything that's moldy or has a big bruise or anything, you can't make it better by canning it. So it's better to compost those items rather than take the risk that it may not can properly for you and can make you sick. It reminded me the other day, I picked some tomatoes and my son went out to the garden. He goes, why is there a tomato underneath? Yeah, he found another tomato by the deck. I said, oh, it jumped out of the bowl and I just forgot to go get it. Had a little bruise. I know that I bruised it at that moment. I know what happened to it. So if you have something that is bruised that maybe you dropped when you're harvesting it, you can use that. Don't get me wrong. But if it's something that's really moldy, has a lot of infestation of insects, it's really best not to use that produce. The other thing is when you are canning, and just like anything, you should use reputable, creditable resources. I have some examples, and I'm just gonna, hopefully you can kind of see them. I can't really tell, I think you can, but we'll see. If you can't, let me know. And I can put my arms out further. One of them that is written for written materials is the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning. It has all these different areas, so fruits, vegetables, jams, jellies, meats, fermented products, and such. What this the one thing I like about this is that it gives you, so apple butter is in the front. It gives you the recipe. It tells you about how many apples you need for so many pint jars. It will give you the yield. So, and then it gives you the procedure. And that, if you do any baking, procedure just means the directions on how to properly prepare the produce for it going into the jar. That's all. That's all, basically all it means. And then it has a chart at the bottom. You can see that, but that chart right there is what that tells you when you, whether you're pressure canning or boiling water canning, there's a few things you need to know. You need to know what size jars you're going to use. There are half pints, there are pint jars, and there are quart jars. So if I look at a recipe and it tells me half pints or pints and quarts, I know that I can can either half pint, pints, or quarts. But if I look at another recipe that says just pints, I know that I cannot can in a quart jar because either it's never been tested in that size jar, or maybe it was tested in that jar and it was not considered safe. So like my pasta sauce over here, see if I can grab that pasta sauce. Now these are pint jars, and they are all, I can only can this particular recipe in pint jars. Now for us, it would make more sense if I could just do it in a quart jar. Well, I can't do that because it's tested in a pint jar. It's safe in a pint jar. I can because I love my family and I don't want anything to happen to them. So I'm going to do it right. I'm going to follow the rules. So I just opened 2 jars. It's fine. I have plenty of canning jars. Anybody who cans knows that you have lots of canning jars. You kind of start to gather them. It's kind of odd, but you just learn to do that. So it tells you the size jar. It tells you the style of pack. And style of pack just means when so like these carrots were hot pack. When I sliced them all, I heated them with water. When they went into the hot jars, the carrots were hot. I could also do a raw pack with my carrots. I personally like a hot pack if it's available because 1, I can get more stuff in. 2, when I'm trying to get the head space, and a raw pack is a little bit tougher. So like the dilly beans I made, that's a raw pack, which just means that everything went in there. The beans were raw and the brine goes over the top and it's hot. And then I can it that way. It's kind of hard to get all the air bubbles out of it. Then, so it's a hot pack, pints or quarts. And then it talks about altitude. You might also see this called elevation. And elevation just means how far up you are from sea level. The way it was explained to me and how my little brain understands it is at sea level, 0, water boils at 212. Always. You can't change it. But as you move up in elevation or altitude, water boils at a lower temperature, which means that the temperature inside that jar isn't quite as high as 212, right? So if you are in Nebraska, which in Nebraska, we actually have some elevation between 1,000 and 5,000. So in this book, it talks about the different altitudes. So anywhere from 0 to 1,000, it's 5 minutes. From 1,000 to 6,000, it's 10 minutes. And above 6,000, it would be 15 minutes. So basically that means 1, you have to know what your elevation is or your altitude is. A couple ways to do that. If you have a smartphone, it probably will tell you if you have a GPS tracker on it, it will tell you what your elevation is. There's an app for that. Or you can do whatsmyelevation.com, put in your address, and it will pop up what your elevation is at that level. So it's really simple. It's no guessing. It's no trying to figure out where the little line, squiggly line is in Nebraska, where the elevation changes and stuff. So keeping that in mind. So that's the USDA way they do it. There's also the traditional Ball Blue Book, and you want to look for one that's a little bit newer. I have some ancient ones that are old, but I don't use them because some of the testing has changed and they have said that some of the recipes are not safe. So the newer ones have the safe tested recipes. You can see that I have little postmarks on the Post-it notes on the top to kind of go to where I want to. There's also a couple other ball canning books. And I'll be honest with you, sit down with them, go through them, see what you like, what you don't like. I think this one had the Thai dipping sauce in it that we tried last year. I thought, oh, this is great. We like Thai food. Well, I'll try the recipe. It was so vinegary that I'll never make it again the way they tell us so that it's safe to process. But I will make it again with less acidity to it, but then I will freeze it because that means I've changed their proportion of ingredients. The pH has changed, which may throw it off. So it can't be done in a boiling water canner. And I can't figure out, I will never be able to figure out unless I'm testing it in a pressure canner. So I will make the Thai sauce, but we will not make it and can it. We will freeze it, which is good to kind of as a reminder to you that if you have something that you really love, but you can't find one that's compatible in any creditable resource, it's probably available for you to just freeze. And it's okay to freeze. Freezing is part of food preservation. You just need to be smart about some of your having enough space in your freezer, of course. So I've seen some pop-ups. Is there something that I need to address before I go on?
Well, we've been sharing some of the resources. I also we shared the whatsmyelevation.com.
Yep.
And just as an example, the altitude of Omaha is around 1,100 feet. Yep. So you have to do the over 1,000. So instead of when I do my jams and jellies, instead of 5 minutes, it's 10 minutes or whatever, right?
Yeah. Yes. And in the USDA book, it automatically adjusts and has it on that chart. If you have the Ball Blue book, and I didn't, honestly, you think I'd be smarter than this, but the other day I was looking at it going, there is no mathematical way on their chart. So like if it's between 1,000 and 3,000, you increase it by 5 minutes. If it's between 3,000 and 6,000, you increase it by 10 minutes, and then it goes up, but it doesn't go up in the same proportions. So it's very confusing, unfortunately. That's why I like the USDA one. Also, I like online, the National Center for Home Food Preservation has a website that has the recipes, and it actually gives the charts for different elevations and how long you would process it. So you don't have to figure out, is it 5 minutes or am I at 10 minutes or where am I at to add to it. The one thing I do need to say though is most times when you're looking at the recipes inside of these books, and also online, there are a few online that will adjust for elevation, but if they're not telling you they're adjusting for elevation, you have to make the assumption that it's at 0. And so you have to do the calculations to increase it. So if I open this book and I'm going to can, say, pickled cauliflower, it tells me to process it for 10 minutes. When it tells me 10 minutes, that just means it's at 0 elevation. I have to go to the chart. I have to know I'm above 1,000, so I would add 5 minutes to it. But if I was out in the western part of the state and I was above 3,000 feet, I would add 10 minutes to it.
Yes.
So,
For example, Scotts Bluff is at 3,900 feet, so you would have to do that.
yeah.
So there was one question that we actually got really early, and I've been holding it till this section. And you kind of mentioned the extension books and resources in the USDA, but they were wondering about suggestions for recipe books other than the ball book.
Yep. So there's the So Easy to Preserve book that comes from the University of Georgia, which is a collaboration between the National Center for Home Food Preservation and the University of Georgia worked together to test recipes. And then Georgia had put out this So Easy to Preserve canning book. And so that's actually a creditable book also. Trying to think. I will be honest with you, it's almost impossible for us to like police every canning book that's out there. But if they are kind of our general rule of thumb is if they don't have anything about elevation or altitude, if they're not, if they're saying things that are low acid can be done in a boiling water canner, run from that book immediately, because that just means that anybody that cans, if I wanted to, I could put all kinds of bad information out there if I could get somebody to publish it, basically is what they're saying. So these books are creditable. The USDA book, the So Easy to Preserve. Penn State actually has a really nice canning book. It looks very similar to the USDA one in that spiral bound thing that you can purchase from them. So any place that is a .edu would have creditable information, because that's what we do. We love you. We don't want you to be doing things that are bad for you or the family.
And I think with that,
go ahead.
It needs to come from a university or USDA or National Center for Home Preservation or canning company.
Yes.
Because lots of people, they go on Pinterest, they go on TikTok, they go on Facebook,
yep,
and they see people doing stuff and they copy it. And most of those recipes are not tested and safe. So if it doesn't come from a tested research-based source, you should not use it.
Yes, and the other thing is that I find a lot of times, and we're kind of voyeurs out there, of course. I mean, there are some times where we make comments, but a lot of times we're just kind of not skulking, but stalking different things just to see the feel of stuff and if it's creditable or not. If you have a lot of people that put out credible information are going to cite that information. They're very proud that they're giving you the best and safest information. So a lot of times what I tell people is if you look at a recipe and they're crediting, Penn State, Purdue, University of Berkeley, Wisconsin, all these different universities that are doing testing, if they're citing those, it's going to be creditable, even though it's a source that's not the university source, but that they got it from the university source. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I think we opened up a tangent because someone asked how are recipes tested.
Well, the how they're tested is basically you think about your home kitchen, but somebody in a white coat with lots and lots of pH equipment and testing temperatures and bacteria. Because what they do is they take in the lab, they take a jar and and literally it looks like our canning jars. I mean, things you would use in the home. They're testing in things that you have access to. So they take a jar, they have lids that are specially made that they can put a probe down into the center to be able to measure the temperature and such. And then they actually use either pressure canners or boiling water canners. I mean, they have like your equipment. But the thing with their equipment is they are monitoring in this kind of computerized system what is happening in the jar. They also put bacteria purposely. They put bacteria in the jar. Then they process it, check to see what the temperature is. And then when they're done, they take that product out and they culture it to see if there's still that bacteria in it or not. So they're purposely putting bacteria in. We don't purposely do that, but that's what they're doing. So everything that's being tested is being tested based upon the bacteria load. They're testing it based upon the temperature and how the temperature either penetrates or induction moves around inside of that jar. So things that we can't can, and the reason we cannot can them is because they're too thick. Like if you do pumpkin, if you do chunks, 1-inch chunks of pumpkin, you can pumpkin, but you can't mash pumpkin and then put it into a jar and can it, because that impedes the heat element of that product, which then can make it unsafe at the end. So pumpkin we can do in chunks, but we can't do it in pureed. And if you want it pureed, you can freeze it. Still food preservation. It's still gonna work for you. We just can't do it safely and make it a shelf-stable product. So we do have, and it's been fun. This at the university, we have a couple of specialists that's working with a PhD doctorate person that is testing some different berries that we're trying to figure out if there's safe ways to can it. And literally somebody had to go down and explain to them how to use the food preservation equipment. How do you use a boiling water bath canner? How do you use the atmospheric steamer? Because they're really good. Scientists are really good at being scientists, but sometimes this part gets beyond their control. So it was kind of fun teaching somebody that is so much smarter than me how to use just a basic piece of equipment.
So that's all the questions that we've had come in, but I'm going to ask this just so like we cover this. You know, we have all these recipes, but isn't the way that my grandma did it years ago, isn't that, you know, the way I can still do it? Like, why do I need to boil water or bath my jams and jellies if I can just turn the jars upside down, right?
Yeah. And those are legitimate questions, because if you look on some of your the older pectin containers, you can actually find that as still part of the processing. They consider that part of the processing method for some of the pectin. You got to remember that pectin companies are selling pectin. They're not testing to see the safety or validity of a sealed product. They just want you to get a gelled product in a jar and be happy. They're not looking at the safety of it. And when we look at jams, and especially jams and jellies, we used to tell people, oh, just put wax on top of it and then put your lid on and put your ring on. Well, we don't recommend wax anymore either, because people would either be very heavy-handed with wax or they would be very light with the paraffin. And so there'd be pin dots and mold would grow, and we discovered that with mold. Not all mold is created equal. Plus, mold actually isn't just at the top. Visually, you could see it. There's little spores that move down through the product, so you can't actually get rid of all of the mold. And so I don't know about you, but I spend a lot of money on my insurance, and I don't want to have to pay my deductible. So I prefer to do things fairly safe. So yes, we used to tell people to do that. We know better now. We don't wear the same clothes our grandparents wore. Well, some people don't actually, but some people do. But the other thing is, when we talk about canning, we're really talking about heating the core extracting the air and pulling that seal back down. And that can only be accomplished in this either a pressure can or boiling water can or atmospheric pressure can or atmospheric. I keep on calling pressure because it's not pressure, it's atmospheric steam canner. See, it's new. Well, it's not really new, but it's hard for me to roll off the tongue and such. So yeah. So that's the main reason there. So I'm also just gonna open up a kettle that we thought we had closed a few weeks ago when I went on vacation, but I'm sure that this will open it up again. When you are making recipes, when you're looking at recipes, either online or through the written literature, your ingredient list will be there, just like a normal ingredient recipe. But many times when you're making pickles, there will be vinegar, and then it will say 5% acidity. How do you know if your vinegar is 5% acidity? Well, for this one, very evident. It's right here, right underneath the label. You can't read this, it's too white, but believe me, it's right there. I can read it. Even my husband found it the other day. He was giving me a bad time. He's like, is that 5% acidity? Because of course we have talked about it. But apple cider, this particular apple cider vinegar is just a local Hy-Vee brand, and it doesn't say 5%. So how do you know it's 5%? Well, on the side where all your ingredients are listed, it tells you right there, acidified to 5%. So you know that these two vinegars, if I want to make something like dill pickles, cowboy candy, dilly beans, I needed to use a vinegar that was 5%. Nothing higher, nothing lower. And I don't know about you, but this was at the grocery store here in town. This was at another grocery store, box store here in town. Didn't have any problems finding them. So but make sure you're reading the labels and the ingredients to make sure that you have the right, because raise that acidity level high enough. So like my dilly beans, they're green beans, but I've acidified them so I could do them in my boiling water canner. Actually, I did them in the atmospheric steam canner, but in that area, my green beans that are just plain green beans, I had to do in my pressure canner because my temperature had to be higher because I didn't acidify these. So I needed a higher temperature to can them. Whereas my dilly beans, I acidified them. I can do it in a lower temperature.
So I have one probably final question, and then we'll call it a night. And I think this can also let us talk a little bit more about the canning process, but how tight do you tighten the jar rings? And is it any different for hot water bath versus pressure canning?
It is not different for either process. You can see, if I can bring my jar up here so you can see it a little better. Here's my lid. Just pop it on. Always make sure you clean the rim really well. I'm a sloppy jar filler person, so you always want to make sure it's clean really well. And then when you start to put it down, I finger tighten it until it starts to resist, and then just a teeny bit more. You don't want to, and I'm going to ruin my basically my lid here, but if I do this and it's really, really tight, it doesn't allow the air to escape. And sometimes you find when you're canning, you'll find that as air's escaping, that sometimes you have a little bit of liquid come out, and that's okay. But if you do it too tight, it keeps everything in there and you might buckle your lid. So if you have buckled lids, you're tightening your lids too tight. So these particular lids, just finger tight, and it goes right in your canner. I will be honest with you that if you're using some of the other lids, like Tatler lids and such, follow those directions to the letter. These lids, once they come out, if they've loosened, don't tighten them. Just let them sit, they're fine. So you tighten it, put it in, process it. It's been processed, you take it out, you let it sit, and then you take the rings off when you store them. If you have things like Tatler lids, you actually, their directions are to put them on, then you process, then when you take them out, you tighten them. So my biggest thing is read the directions for whatever product you're buying, because every company does it just a little bit different. And if you don't follow their lead, you could prevent a seal from occurring.
Mm-hmm. So one last question. I lied to you. For a dial gauge pressure canner, I've read that they need to be tested, and the extension office does this. Can you give us details on the process, cost, and is it done the same day?
So there is no cost. And yes, as long as you make an appointment. So basically, here in our office, I can't speak for the other offices across the state, but on our food.unl.edu food preservation page, there's an actual button where you can click for pressure gauge testing, and it'll bring up a map that shows you all the places that will go ahead and test. Here in Omaha, and if you live close to the Omaha area, what we do is we just ask that you call and make an appointment, so to make sure that Cindy or I are in at that particular time so that we can test it. I'll be honest with you, it probably takes people longer to drive here than it actually does for us to do the testing of the lid. But it is important to make sure that your lid and your gauge is accurate. Because if it's not accurate, you could be under processing or over processing. And both of those are, under processing is bad safety wise, over processing basically is bad quality wise. So you want to make sure you're doing it appropriately. So again, just call in the office, making an appointment. We don't charge for it. Happy to do it as a service to people.
Well, thank you, Nancy, for this wonderful information, getting lots of rave reviews in the comments from folks. So thank you very much. We're going to end the recording here and let folks head on to the rest of their evening.
Sounds great. Thanks so much for having me.